Hey, what's up, everybody? Back with Monty's Gems, and this week we've got two special guests, two very close friends of mine since I was very little, since I can remember, and I would say, I would say these two are very, very intelligent, and that's something that I admire a lot about them, and I think that's something that our dad admired a lot about them too, just their ability to decision make and also just their intellectual abilities and at the same time their ability for humor and being able to know when to make jokes, when not to make jokes, and just all of that. And so I want to say thanks to both of you for joining us because I'm really excited to talk to you guys and see what you guys have to say.
So we introduce you to Ethan and Jesse
Oh, yeah.
Pattison. Yes, they are identical twins. So when Jake talks about how intelligent they are, could you imagine if there would have only been one kid that came out, how intelligent that kid would have been? If both of these two combined, it would have been absolutely amazing. The world probably wouldn't be able to contain it.
Mm.
But no, we're super happy to be able to see them and be around them. Their parents were a staple in the small town that we grew up in the community. And so they've both been working really, really hard to essentially be themselves and individualistic and become them. I think figuring out who they are and trying to figure that out. So I think to get started, what I really wanted to get into is what it was like being an identical twin. And so when I think of like having a second Chad, if I were to look over and see somebody that looked exactly like me, like this good looking, had this nice of hair, and wanted to wear these shirts, I would get kind of pissed. And I probably like it would just be an all out fight because I'm super unique in what I like to wear. And so it's like I don't want someone who's exactly like me. Like I don't even like having the same clothes as one other person, whether they look like me in the face and the hair. And so I just kind of want to hear your guys' opinion of what it was like growing up as identical twins.
I think I have the opposite experience where I look at Jesse and people get us confused, and I'm like, shoot, I thought I looked better than that. Yeah, from my perspective, I loved being a twin. I know that a lot of people have had worse experiences with it, but overall, I really enjoyed it. I think, yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and I think one of my favorite things about being a twin was having somebody that you can always trust and rely on and know exactly like the way that their mind is working and thinking. And I think Jesse and I are probably more similar than a lot of twins are. I think we have pretty similar personalities, interests, opinions, ways that our minds work. And so I think it's always really helpful just to have someone that you know you can rely on and trust and you know when in class projects and things like that when we were in school we'd always work together because it's like I know what I'm getting when I'm working with him. So I had a great experience. I think it pushed me to work harder at things because there's that bit of competition. That's also like a little stressful. But yeah, I loved being a twin, or I do love. I shouldn't say past tense.
I think the one thing I'll add to the competition, and I was talking about this with my parents last night actually, is that they tried like super hard to keep us from being like overly competitive one another or having any like sort of like older brother dynamic.
Mm.
And so it was actually until about we were like I want to say 8 years old that we thought we both came out simultaneously. And so when anybody would ask us which one of you was the older twin, we would always say, "What are you talking about? Like we're the we were twins." And then I think we were about 8 years old, which actually seems a little bit too old to still believe that.
Yeah.
I
Uh,
feel like we were older when that happened.
what's you think older
I
than
think we
me?
were older. Not gonna lie.
No, Jake's talking about how intelligent we were.
Yeah.
We were young.
Yeah.
No, it was Callaway Bird, who Jake knows as well. I think Chad knows
Yeah.
too. Was the one that told us that that wasn't possible, and then we asked our parents and figured it out.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I
I
think
came
we
out second.
You
yeah,
did?
Ethan came out second,
Yeah, I was
Okay.
just
second.
for the record. But yeah, we were pretty competitive at a young age, I would say, and I think that fizzled out by the time we got to at least partway through high school, um, and into college. I remember um, kind of going back and forth with like academic stuff or sports stuff in middle school, Ethan made the A team for basketball and I made the B team. And so that was a hit. But then as we got older, we kind of started to diverge a little more and didn't partake in all of the same activities. Like he did the swim team and I didn't want to do that. And so we started to split off at an older age. But I think that, like Ethan said, the competitiveness I kind of think fueled us on a lot to try to do well in whatever it was we were doing when we were young. And then the one I think the downside that I think Ethan would probably agree with is that socially it could make it a little bit too easy to not try to make new friends. We didn't experience that much in like high school, but on our travel baseball team, I remember both of us kind of just sticking to ourselves with one another and not really getting to know the other kids on our team. And so I feel like growing up, it maybe stunted social growth a little bit. Would you agree with that, Ethan?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think travel baseball is a good example of the competitive thing because I did not want to play travel baseball at all. And Jesse was doing it. And so I felt like I had to do it. We were both terrible at baseball.
Well, neither of us are good.
Jesse wanted to play. And so I felt like I had to do it.
We played with Jake on teams a couple of times. Jake is very good at baseball. Ethan and
he's
I
very
were
good.
more bench warmers, but we did
That's
that
right.
together.
That's something you guys were saying that I think is super important to just growing up. I always saw you guys as, yeah, you were brothers and you were identical twins, but you guys were always like best friends almost. Like you would see like the siblings fighting every once in a while. It's like your typical stuff. It's like, yeah, that comes out. But it's like at the end of the day, you guys never, I don't know, you always seemed like how a best friend would act. And it's like, that's really special that you have that all the time. It's like, and you get to go home with it. And regardless of what the outcome is, it's at the end of the day, you're going back and you get to see this person that's like super close to you all the time. And I think there's something super special to that. And you guys were never like hated each other and did stuff just to spite each other, but you kind of worked with each other and made each other better rather than tore each other down most of the time.
Yeah, because I
Thanks.
think
Yeah.
the common thought is that, well, you guys are twins, like you grew up, you're like in the same house, exact same age, like you're going to have to like each other. But as you've grown into your adulthood and now you guys are living in two totally separate, different places, I would like to hear about what making friends has looked like to you currently and maybe how difficult that is to try to make friends with people who have super common interests, who have maybe the same moral values, who maybe have the same personality. Because I think even for me, coming all the way across the country away from my family, it's like, holy cow, like a lot of people do not get my sarcasm and it offends the crap out of them. And so I'm like, okay, got to be a little careful there. And so as I come down to another place, it's like, okay, this is way more difficult to find people who get me and I get, and we kind of jive and we can kind of just pick up and go from there. Like, what does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, I'd never thought about this from the lens of being a twin until you're asking now, but I find that it's hard to feel like I have a lot in common with people, and I still, make friends, and they're not necessarily as good of friends as like Jesse or certain friends that I've known for a long time. But I have noticed like I feel like it's hard for me to feel like I have a lot in common with people, and I wonder if that does come from being a twin because, and even honestly, like our sister is super similar to us too. And
Okay.
so I think just like growing up in a situation where you've got people with such tight similarity, it's like you kind of come to expect that in the other people that you're meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually hadn't thought about that much either. I think the one time that I remember having a harder time making friends was like at the beginning of college. So Ethan and I like made the intentional decision to not live together because we knew that we would just be forced to kind of get to know people quicker if we were not always with one another. And I feel like that was probably the one time in my life where I feel like I had a really hard time getting to know people. But I think that probably came more from like putting too much into school, more so than like being a twin and having a hard time from that separation.
And so that's really interesting to hear you guys say that, because when I look back on my childhood and going to Trinity and being inside of a class of maybe 13 to 15 people, I started realizing as I got out of my adult life, like how difficult it was for me to like approach people or go up and like want to start a conversation, just because I've had this small inner circle so much. But I think there's also been this perspective of maybe not good enough or not being accepted, because if you're in a really small group of people and you grow up in a really, really small town and you get made fun of or you get ridiculed, and yeah, you start really going into your shell and being way more fearful of trying to reach out and trying to be yourself, because you're always trying to be accepted. And sometimes when you grow up in a bigger city, like when I moved down to Miami, it's just like everybody is doing all their own stuff. Like this guy's over here doing this. And it's like not everybody is looking under you with a small microscope, looking at every single move you make. And then they're there to just kind of maybe antagonize you or make fun of you. And so as I've thought about wanting to have children and growing them up, some of the concerns I've had is, while I think a private school system is really, really good for their education and maybe helping them to stay out of the current societal views and those types of things, is that it can be a safe place. I feel like for me personally that I was kind of put inside of a cage too much, to where it took me way longer to learn how to be an adult and become myself. And even at 40 years old, I'm still figuring that all out, because it's like, holy cow, like I've just been, what is it when your parents kind of coddle you, or they
Shelter.
yeah, sheltered. Great word for it. That's exactly how I felt. It was like my parents were trying to keep me from getting hurt, and they had great intentions, but it wasn't super beneficial, because when it comes to being successful, I always felt like asking people questions, it was bothering people, or approaching people was bothering people. But now I realize that it comes from healthy communication. And it's not something that I really grew up with. And so the more that I do it, it's like, wow, this is how you really build yourself. This is how you figure out who you are and go across. Secondly, at a small school like Trinity, when there's only 3 girls in your class and there's 10 boys and you're all competing for those 3 girls, I think as you look at yourself and maybe you struggle, like it's like, okay, if these 3 girls say no, like that means that like I'm no good. And to me, that was super demeaning in my head in terms of my self-confidence and the insecurities that I started having. Whereas you go into a bigger city, like I would much rather go to a college where there is way more girls than there are guys, because that increases my chances. And it's not that it increases my chances, but it gives me the ability to understand how to have healthy conversations with women and not be afraid of rejection. And that's something that wasn't always in interacting with women, but also in work and just sharing my abilities in sales. Like you go into a sales, and that rejection was really present in sales. And while I enjoy talking with people and interacting with people, I don't like being rejected at all. So like, how do you guys feel about that? It's awesome that you guys had that close bond so that you can kind of maybe shelter each other. And did you feel like you did that?
Yeah,
I don't
are you?
know
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know that I feel like we sheltered each other. I think we didn't necessarily experience things the same way. Or I guess I'll speak for myself because I don't know what Ethan has to say. But I didn't necessarily experience things the same way. And perhaps part of that is because we stayed at Trinity through 6th grade and then hopped over to the middle school in 7th grade. And so I think that's probably kind of similar to how I would want to do things for my kids, because I think like early on going to a Christian school, you kind of develop the faith that I would want to teach my kids, and morals, and like you said, kind of keep them out of the ways of thinking that have become dominant in our society. But then being able to go over to the middle school, I think we got like a larger number of people that we got to interact with, and it was a little bit less sheltering. And so I felt like that balance was pretty good for us.
I think the other thing with that too is we had a lot of exposure to other people outside of Trinity. So like we lived in a neighborhood with like 14 guys in it, and like
Good
all
point.
sorts of different backgrounds and personalities and whatnot. And so that really helped. We did like sports like like Jake did with, baseball in town and different things where you're getting exposed to different people. So all I know is by the time that we moved to the public school, it felt like we already had like a friend group when we were going there. So it wasn't like we were so sectioned off. So I guess, yeah, when I'm thinking about like doing something with my kids, I think I would never want to put them in a situation where they have no exposure to non-Christian spaces, but maybe, something like sheltering a little bit until they get a little older, like Jesse said.
I think I also don't remember shooting any shots at ladies at Trinity. I think I bided my time until I got to middle school. Ethan bided his time until
College.
College.
Yeah.
No, I think Ethan bided his time until high school.
Yeah, end of high school.
End of
Should have
high
bided it a little longer.
But mentally, did you guys feel that same thing that I'm talking about, or because you guys grew up in that maybe that neighborhood setting where you guys had other guys who you were able to have healthy conversations and it didn't feel like you had to go to school and be the best and be a perfectionist or you weren't going to get accepted? Because it seemed like inside of, I forgot about that, your neighborhood where you guys were pretty accepted and it was a great big group of guys where you guys were always getting to go and hang out.
Yeah, I think so. I think that we maybe experienced it in experienced a similar thing, but for a different reason. So like, I think like a lot of social capital when you're in middle school, high school age is like, how good are you at athletics? And so Jesse and I were pretty subpar, and so
I'd say we were pretty average.
we were average. Yeah, we'll put it that way. But so I always felt like that was the area where I was maybe more worried about like how people would perceive me or what people would think of me. And I remember feeling like pretty insecure in that, especially thanks to Jesse, us doing travel baseball where everyone was really good and we were like not. I think that like exacerbated things a little bit and made us a lot more like maybe nervous or insecure about interacting with people because suddenly your perception is, wow, everybody's better than me. And so
My
Yeah.
value is solely based on how good I am at baseball. Yeah.
yeah.
I was going to say the same thing, and I think I do remember noticing that piece at Trinity because we had a fair number of good athletes in our grade, just I think disproportionately even to other grades. Like we had Jake, Sam, Brecken, and Blake all in our grade, and they were all pretty athletic. And so I do remember noticing that, and I do wonder if that is maybe part of what pushed Ethan and I to care a little bit more about academic stuff, is because you kind of try to find your lane with what the thing is that you can do well at.
It's interesting that you guys say that because I remember being at Trinity and specifically like, sure, I may have been athletic, but I felt the opposite way that you guys did. Like I felt super comfortable on the baseball field or whatever. But when it came to the classroom, like I felt like I was the dumb one in class. Even though I wasn't dumb, just comparatively to the kids in our class, we had a very smart class. And just you guys, the way, I don't know, it seemed like you guys had very accelerated learning and you picked things up so fast. And I was just sitting there like, what? Like I was still having trouble with reading comprehension. Like I have to read things over like 4, 5, 6 times to understand it. And you guys were over there understanding it the first time. I was like, oh my God, I'm so stupid. And then when I got to high school, things changed a little bit. And I realized that it was just a very smart, small section of people. But yeah, I felt the exact same way, but on the other field of life, I guess.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is when you're in that highly unique subset of athletes and then intellects, and it's just like you think that everybody is like this. When you guys were all very fortunate in just being in that small group of some people were extremely smart, some people were extremely good athletes, and then you go out in the real world, it's like, wow, if I would have went to such and such high school, I could have been the valedictorian there. Or, yeah, like on the varsity baseball team or football team or whatever it is. It's just like
We
Baroque.
all went to Baroque.
We all could have probably done really well there.
I think like something that comes to my mind too when we're talking about this is a conversation that Jesse and I had with Jake like maybe 2 years ago when we were rock climbing. And Jake, you were telling us how people would make comments like, "Oh, you're so natural at X, baseball, basketball, whatever the sport was." And you're like, "That's not it, or at least that's not like all that it was. Like you were outside like practicing every day with your brothers and like working hard to get really good at it." And I think when we were kids, maybe I would have been like, "Oh, like I'm pretty good at this school thing." But in reality, we were putting so much time into it that I personally I don't feel like I'm like smart. Like I don't see that about myself, but we spent so much time on it, and from a really young age, our mom was like having us study and learn how to read. I can remember like sitting in our living room when we were really little and doing that. And so I also think it's like I don't think it's like, oh, if you were having a hard time at Trinity, that means you were like less smart. It's like, no, it's like what are you spending your time doing? I think,
Right. Yeah, where you put the focus on.
Well, and I think that was the main difference is like, so our dad had us on this road is like, this is what it looks like. This is how you play professional baseball. And so like for me and Jake both, it was like, all right, go out there and bust your ass every single day, day in and day out. Focus exactly on that. Don't look over here. Don't look over there. Just stay 100% focused and the results will speak for themselves. And as long as you don't get injured and you keep pursuing it, you can do it. And I think, for you guys, going and doing that, for me, baseball had to be something that I wanted to do and I enjoyed doing. And I think if at any point where I just hated it, like I'll speak to other people who have played professional baseball and they lose their career towards an injury and they say, man, I'm so glad it's over. And I'm just looking at them and say, what do you mean? What do you mean you're so, it's like, I hate batting practice. I hated going to the gym. It's like, dude, that's the whole experience. That's what's awesome about it. That's what's enjoyable. Like you didn't love baseball. You were just doing it whether you were going to make money or because it was something you were forced to do. When you guys think about education, and I think your parents were very, very strict on creating that process of what it looked like to be able to achieve the academic results that you guys achieved. Was that ever stressful? Was it ever overwhelming? Or were you guys just so into it where it just became an enjoyable process?
I don't think I don't think I ever looked at it as an enjoyable process. I think I'm at the point now where some of the experiences that I've been able to have because of it have been enjoyable. Um, I also I also think the way that Ethan framed like the amount of time like being put in is probably not entirely representative of like the entirety of our times from like being little through high school with how our parents handled things. I would say our mom like put a fair amount of time into teaching us at like a very young age. So like before preschool, she was like trying to teach us to read, and we were doing these like little flashcard things. She had us in piano because she had read that that helps with kids' brain development early on. And so it was like the early years that she was like really trying to help us develop well academically. I would say by the time we were in like grade school, I don't remember ever doing anything academically outside of like the homework we were given for class. So it's not like we were doing like an abnormal amount of work. I think in middle school, same thing. And I think that they always placed a high value on it. So we were always taught like, when you study, you're going to do your best and you should study until you feel like you can get an A on a test. But I never remember feeling like I wouldn't say our parents were like helicopter parents or like they ever put any level of stress on us. In middle school, for example, there was like this website called Power School where parents could check grades and like keep on top of things to make sure their kids were doing well. Our parents didn't even know how to log into Power School. Like they never looked into that stuff. I think they just developed the I think they just developed kind of the habits in us well early on, and then we took it from there. And I would say it was maybe like sophomore year of high school that Ethan and I got a bit more obsessive about trying to excel in school. Would you say that's accurate, Ethan?
No, I don't think that's
Okay.
quite right.
Okay.
I think that's when it became like tangible because there was actually a lot of work to do.
Okay.
But I think we both would have always been obsessive as far as like making sure you got a good grade, whatever it
Okay.
took. It just
Yeah,
took
that's
less
probably
when
right.
we were younger, like less time.
Sure.
But
So it wouldn't have necessarily stood out in terms of the amount of time we were spending on school until a little bit later in high school. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, but I would say, yeah, again, what you said though is we spent time doing it when we were younger, and also the values that they kind of instilled in us were what carried us. I think the stress with it more so probably comes from being twins. Wouldn't you say, Jesse? Or at least for me, I feel like you experienced this less, but I feel like what really propelled us to work so hard is because like you're a certain way and there's another person that's essentially identical to the way you are. So if that person is doing better, it's like, well, you can be doing better too. At least that's how I viewed it for a decent amount of time. I feel like Jesse dealt with that less, probably because Jesse went harder than I did, to be honest. And so he was kind of like what I was like looking at a little bit, but yeah.
I
So you
think
were
that
looking at the genes, and this person has the exact same genes as I have. So my capabilities is there. So if you ever wanted what your true potential could be, and maybe you weren't doing enough, you could just look at the other person and see it right there. That's really interesting, man. Because
Yeah.
I think we all want to figure out what our true potential is, but if we don't have that model right there next to us, we're just out and figuring out on our own. And I'll say it from a diet, nutrition, health, and fitness standpoint, right? So I get really, really psyched up about those things, but each and every day I have a choice of what I put in my mouth. And so while there could be a pop over there, or maybe it's eating ketchup with my French fries, which I finally gave up this year, to be able to figure out what my ultimate potential is that I pretty much have to do everything perfectly, and that's how I can see it. Where you guys have the opportunity just to do things a little bit better than the other person, so that other person can actually say, wow, it's like that's attainable for me too.
Yeah.
And in terms of being twins, were there any things where you guys were like could think the same thing? Had you guys ever tried out those types of things where you or maybe like something happened and you both had like an eerie feeling? Are there any types of feelings like that you guys ever experienced together?
No.
I mean we can still communicate without a phone.
Yeah, Jesse
Kidding.
blinks and I'm there.
I don't think so either. I remember though we used to get that question a lot, and so in grade school we each had memorized like a really long number, so that
Oh
if somebody
yeah.
were to ask us that, then we could be like, all right, here's what I'm thinking, and the other one would be ready to follow up on their end.
Do you remember the number?
I don't.
That's funny.
Yeah.
What about like in terms of like pranks? Did you guys ever use your looks to be able to prank? Like, did you guys ever go on dates with like the other girlfriends? Did you guys ever prank your parents? Did you ever try to do that? Anything like that?
I feel like in one sense we were pretty straight laced, probably because we were like worried about being dishonest and we like had that value. I remember there was one time in high school where Jesse had to like leave school early and he just left, and I had to go and like tell the teacher that I was leaving school. I had to like leave for something.
I don't recall this.
Oh, Jesse?
I do not recall this.
It
The
was
only
when
time.
you had Mr. Locke for seminar.
Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I just don't recall that. I do remember doing pranks, but nothing like twin related. The one thing I can think of would have been after we graduated from college, actually. I lived in Milwaukee for like 9 months, and so I built a whole group of friends there, and a lot of people didn't know I had
Oh
a
yeah.
twin. And so I had Ethan visiting, and he was already married to his wife Jasmine at that point. And so we had him um like enter kind of like a party type situation, and he was hanging out with our friends, and then his wife walked in and he was like pretending to be me, and then he's like, oh guys, I got dibs, and then he ran up and he gave her a kiss. And so Everybody's like, "What the heck is going on? Jesse's a dog now." But I think that's the only thing that I
There was
recall.
there was another one where Jesse tried to pull a prank on me, and it was kind of like the opposite of that because he bought this tool. So at our bus stops in college, there were little glass frames where like maps went, and he printed off this horrible picture of me, put my Snapchat on it, and wrote out like Snapchat for tummy rubs or something like that. And then he bought this tool to open the sign. He puts that picture
Oh my.
in there, and I'm getting like Snapchats, but the picture looks like him too. So it's like not like it like doesn't work.
So he's riding on the bus, and then people look next to him, and it's just him. It's like that's you on the sign.
That thing was there for like a year or two.
Ethan gave a lot of tummy rubs.
Yeah. Oh man. But Chad was saying earlier, like, because our dad stressed a lot on the athletic side, and it's not just by chance. It's like I remember when I was a very little kid, and Chad and my dad asking me what I wanted to be when I was young, or what I wanted to be when I was older, and I told them like a professional baseball player, and it wasn't like they laughed at me. They were like, okay, well, what are we gonna do to make that dream a reality? So that's kind of why it was so baseball focused. And I was wondering if there was, I don't know, what did you guys want to be when you grew up, I guess? Was it something like in the realm of what you're doing now, or was it something like totally different?
So for me, I didn't even really have anything, to be honest. I think I viewed it as like school, and college is the endpoint. I remember saying that like college is the endpoint when I'm like finally able to relax because I'm not grinding anymore. This was more later in high school. But I didn't have any sort of like grand vision of what I wanted to do, which is why I ended up just going to school for engineering, which is what Jesse was doing, um, and getting a degree that I ended up not using.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't think there was like a consistent goal. I think by the time we were in high school, I think I felt like my strength was in math, and so that's why I decided to do engineering. But I think like the drive was not so much about career, it was about wanting to excel in school. And so that was like Ethan said, I think that that was more the end point than looking like past that.
So you guys both come from an engineering background. It's something that I think is really interesting with engineering, and I think it applies a lot to life. And it sounds like we're all somewhat of the same character and personality type when we grew up. It's a very perfectionist mindset where we try to do everything as good as we possibly can. But it seems like in order to be a really good engineer is that you think of something, you try it, you make a mistake, and then you figure out what you did wrong. And then the only way to progress as an engineer is to do that as many times as you possibly can, as quick as you possibly can. And that's how you attain success. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, to an extent, I think that's true. I think so. Yes, there was definitely a lot of testing that we had to do, and I think that was interesting. I think maybe the part that appealed more to us was the problem solving aspect, where you like have to sit and think hard about like here's a problem, how do I solve that? And even for me, which maybe is a little different from Jesse's, I was really interested in like design, like the aesthetics of things, and even like more towards like the architectural side of things too. So I think those two parts were most appealing to me, but the like the creation and trying things, I think that would be fun, and I think that's probably how like if you work your way to the top and you're in like research and development at an engineering place, you'd probably experience that more. But from my experience, like you got to be at a place for a long time to get to do that type of thing.
I think, well, I do think you see that um, to some extent at any stage, right? So in our senior design, Ethan and I were on the same team, and our job was to make like this high-speed drone, which we never ended up getting to fly because it wasn't strong enough. But hypothetically, it should have gone like 190 miles per hour. And so we did like for that, we had to do like a ton of like trial and error and testing of like different body designs. And we were like putting this in the wind tunnel and trying to decide like how much drag it was going to create. So it looks like a little teardrop shape, if you can imagine. And then it's a quadcopter with these like 4 little propellers. And so Ethan, like he was saying, did a lot of the like aesthetic design for that. But also it was just like a lot of different iterations of trying the same thing over and over to get it to fly as efficiently as possible. So I think that probably lines up pretty well with what Chad's saying about like a lot
Yeah,
of the trial and error.
that's a good example.
And I think when I think about that, it just seems like if we could all pretend to be engineers in life and we just try our best and we try to do something and then we make mistakes and we just keep progressing and making those mistakes as quick as possible, as fast as possible. That's where true success comes from in life. Where if we sit back, like this podcast, for example, right? I've been wanting to do a podcast for probably close to 10 years, but I've been figuring out what microphone do I need? What computer do I need? What video camera do I need? Can I do it? Who am I going to get to do it with? And then one day Jake just says, hey, you want to do a podcast? And I'm like, okay. But it's like, well, we got this like list of things. He's like, no, let's just do it. And he knows how to do all the back end stuff. And I was like, holy crap. Like, that's what it's about. And like, okay, we did one and maybe the audio wasn't good. And then we kept doing it. And now we're to this point here. We're just like, what the hell, dude? I just gave away 8-10 years of my life trying to be this perfectionist and never allowed something to happen. And whether it's, looking for a new job or maybe figuring out what religion looks like, what your religious beliefs are, those types of things. Like do it, figure it out, and continue learning and progressing. When you guys came from engineering to where you are now, where were those moments in your lives where you're like, and I guess, are you guys currently passionate about exactly what you're doing? And how did you kind of come to those decision processes in saying, okay, this is what I want to do now?
I think that kind of mindset very well captures the process that I've taken to end up where I am. I would say I'm like pretty okay with not being 100% like certain about a choice that I make before moving forward. So we talked about doing like engineering. I wasn't like 100% sure at that point, but it's still like you got to be moving in a direction. And when you're moving in that direction, you have the ability to pivot a bit. So I started going into engineering, did a couple of internships, realized I didn't love it as much as I thought. I'd had law school in the back of my mind because my dad was an attorney. So I decided to work for a patent law firm. Tried that out. I loved it. And that was what caused me to go to law school. Even at that point, I wasn't 100% sure about going to law school. I wasn't 100% sure that if I went to law school, I wanted to actually work on patents and keep using my engineering background. But it was still just like, got to be moving forward with something. This, at least at the moment, sounds like the most probable option that I'm going to be happy about. So I moved forward, got there, continued to realize I think engineering was just like kind of a remnant of my past. I wasn't really excited about the work, and I kind of wanted to do something like more directly in tandem with my faith. And so then in law school, I started looking more into like sorts of like public service or nonprofit jobs. I tried a bunch of different things. I looked at like being a prosecutor. I did a lot of child welfare work, so like foster care and adoption stuff. And then I ended up where I am now after doing a summer program with a religious liberty firm called the Alliance Defending Freedom. Ended up applying to them and got a full-time job. And I'd say that now I do think I've found what I am really passionate about because it's both connected to my faith and issues of child welfare that I'm excited about. And so I think that kind of like iterative process that you're talking about with engineering is probably pretty close to how I would say I experienced like landing in a spot where I'm pretty happy with the path I'm taking forward.
Yeah, I think I had a super similar experience, and I would even describe it a little bit from like, for me, from a religious perspective, especially because now I'm pursuing seminary, where it's like, I believe like the way, like a large way that God works is like as we try to follow him with a step in our life, he kind of like guides us as we're obedient and brings us along and shows us more things that he'd have for us. So like for me, I knew I was not super passionate about engineering when we were in college, and really freshman summer, I started getting more serious about my faith, trying to study the Bible, and understand what it says and what it means. And then I see, okay, well, I'm actually really into this thing. And I'm also really into like philosophy and history and science related to Christianity. So I took a step to start an organization on my campus where that was like our focus. We did research, we did outreach, just all sorts of discussions about faith. And through that, then I heard a speech by a professor where he was encouraging Christians to pursue academia. So I was like, okay, shoot, I never even thought this was an option. Let's see what this looks like. I graduate, I'm starting to investigate, like, okay, what would that even look like to be a Christian, like working as a professor, doing research, teaching. So I reached out to like 70 professors across the nation. I got on video calls with some of them. I sent them messages. Ended up just going to seminary at the one that seemed best from that. Then as I'm here, it's like, okay, what's next? Some Bible translating people come to our campus. I've been loving the language stuff, so I'm doing like a lot of Greek and Hebrew studies here. So I go to that. I'm like, wow, I've never even heard this was a thing. And so again, it kind of iterates to be where now that's the direction I'm going. So I feel like each step of the way, it's just like I'm like trying to take that next step, see, okay, is this the thing? Is this right? And so yeah, I would agree with the way you put that.
Explain what it is that you're planning to do right now.
Yeah. Sorry. So right now I'm planning to do Bible translation. So there's still about 800 languages in the world where people don't have the Bible at all in their language and projects haven't been started. So what my wife and I right now, and we're still in the decision-making phase for this, but we're leaning towards after I graduate, moving overseas, living in a new culture, and I would be training people to translate the Bible into their own language, and then I would be checking their translation against the Greek and the Hebrew and the original manuscripts.
Okay, I didn't realize you were doing this. So when you come from the Hebrew and the Greek to the English, as I'm sure you know, is that there's been things that get lost in translation. The idioms, I can't really think of the one off the top of my head, but it doesn't usually, it's very difficult to keep it in its purest form. So when you go to start translating the Bible in these other languages, what are some of the strategies you use to be able to make sure it stays in its purest form?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see. So I'm thinking about how to do this, if I would describe this in English. Okay, so first of all, I would say there's going to be. What's up?
You know,
He was going to tell us in Spanish, but now he had to think about how
No,
to
I'm not, because you said into another culture, so I'm thinking like, well, I'm not doing that, so I can
Oh.
only talk about what I'm doing right now. Yeah, so I would say one that, like you said, no matter what, when you're coming from one language to another, there's going to be information loss. So like a really good example of that is like most people now would say that Greek's verbal system works differently than our modern English one. So we talk about like tense as time based. So like past, present, future. In Greek, it's what they call aspect based. So it's more about like, are you presenting information as a summary? Close in? Are you presenting it from a distance? Like it's more about your proximity to the information. And so obviously with that, you're going to like lose information because it's just not the way we present information. So there's definitely things like that. At the same time, I wouldn't want to decrease someone's confidence in English translations because for the most part, they're really good and they get across essentially the information. And it's not, I would say, extremely common to be losing a ton of crucial information, but there's definitely like little nuances that you're going to lose out on. As far as bringing it into the new language and how to avoid that, I would say being on a team with a large number of people who can kind of rifle through it and comparing what other people are trying to do, I think helps some. I think like what the group that I'm going to do, what's really good about what they do is they're having people from the host language do the translations themselves. So it's not me just going in and learning a language and only being there for a year, right? These are people who understand the language, they understand the culture and what's being communicated. And so I think that helps as well. And so just having like a team with different skills, like a really, I think there's really interesting cultural challenges too. So like, for instance, I saw you guys have been reading the book of Matthew. And in Matthew, it describes John the Baptist. It's like he came neither eating nor drinking. Well, there's a country in Africa, and that's the same language they use to describe like shamans or witch doctors. So when they made a translation into their language and they're like, what does this mean to you? They're like, oh, so John the Baptist is like a witch doctor. It's like, no, that's not what it means. So there's all sorts of like interesting cultural complications. But yeah, I don't know that I have a better answer to that other than like a team with a lot of skills and time put into it.
Can I ask Ethan a question real quick?
Yeah.
Ethan, I'm curious how much you would say is actually lost, like in translation. Do you have an example of something that would illustrate how big or small the loss there would be?
Well, so for me, taking the Bible from the Hebrew to the English is that each Hebrew word has a 3-letter root word. And so when you go and you start looking at these 3-letter root words, you can see how many different Hebrew words are actually connected. So the word for sky is hashamayim, and the word for water is mayim. And so, like in the Bereshit bara Eloheinu melech haolam borei. I just yeah. When God created the heavens and the earth, the water came from the sky, and so that word Hashemayim, water, actually came from that word, and so it's amazing to be able to see in the Hebrew the actual roots, and those things get lost in the translation.
Yeah.
The second concern I have is, which this would be a huge discussion, is the difference between Christianity and Judaism and how they essentially disagree on two small, minute factors, but those minute factors essentially um, declare whether someone is going to have eternal life or they're going to be someone who is following another god, based on which religious side you're looking at or the other. And so, like when it comes to Hebrew, if you look at people's agendas while they're translating the Bible, and that's my biggest concern, is when we go to start translating the Bible, is the agenda that is put on that new translation and how we interpret it and try to understand it. So those are kind of where my questions come from, to be able to understand how you keep it in its purest form. Because again, you have to understand the culture that it was written in, the idioms, who it was written to. All these things are really, really important, that we always have to understand in terms of.
Yeah. I mean, and to add what you're saying about the word roots, that's definitely a thing. So like, for instance, because every word doesn't have a one-to-one correspondence in English, even if we're not talking about different words that are related, you might have to translate the same word differently in close proximity in the text in English, because in the Hebrew or the Greek, it might have like a larger range of meaning that fits both of those uses. But in English, we have to parse it out as two different words, because otherwise it's not going to make sense. So there's that. I think the biggest place where you would notice it is like in poetry. So like, right, Hebrew poetry doesn't work through rhyming, because most Hebrew words rhyme because of the way that they add to the end and add to the beginning, like the way that words are constructed. So Hebrew poetry doesn't work through rhyming, but it works a lot through repetition of concepts, repetition of words, the flow of a line in the like the beats or whatever you'd call it. And I think you do definitely lose that coming to English. And I think that's an important component of what it's being communicated, right? It's not just the propositional information, but how that information is being communicated, and you lose that a little bit. And there are translations where they try to bring that out more. So, right, you can have a translation that's bringing out more of like, what does this word literally mean, and what does it sound like, and what's the poetic effect? And there's translations that prioritize that poetic effect over the literal, try to do like a more of a work with that. My other thoughts, Chad, to the other thing that you're talking about, with agendas of people translating, I think that is definitely a fair concern, right? There's translations that are put out by denominations, for instance,
Watchtower
for
Society.
example, Watchtower Society, right? They have a theological agenda. My mother-in-law was just talking to me about one that's coming out now called the Mirror Bible, that's translated by one guy, and he disagrees with like all the other translations, and it's a paraphrase, and he's very clearly inserting his own theology. So there's definitely, like, I totally agree. I think at least in English, we have the blessing of having so many translations, so that you can have like literally 100 translations in a row, just bam, 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 bam. How do these all render this same verse? And so I think that, at least in English, will help you kind of like root out if there's like some corruptions based on translators.
You could also pull up the interlinear Bible, which is something I've seen a lot of people do, like in Bible studies, for example, where they're not like translating out the sentences. They've just got like the as direct of a translation under each word as you can have, and then you click on the word and you can see like different translations. So even people like me who don't know anything about the languages can at least give like a sort of like a gut check on how reasonable or unreasonable a particular translation is.
And So, okay, I guess both of you guys, as you're kind of going on this, maybe we'll call a spiritual journey and trying to figure out what your purpose is in life, have your religious perspectives changed? Your belief systems changed at all from how you grew up in maybe a Lutheran mindset?
Yeah. I would say in college, I was really trying to figure that out. And I went through a period between freshman and sophomore year where I wouldn't say I was extremely questioning everything, but it was significant. I was like, okay, does God really exist? Is this Jesus thing true? What do I believe about all this? So I went through a period of questioning, and I mean, the summary of that is I came out with stronger convictions on Christianity in general. So like I'm personally I'm very convinced that God exists. I'm very convinced that Jesus lived and died and rose from the dead. I believe those things very strongly, but there's like different like smaller theological things that have changed for sure since being a Lutheran. Like um I mean, one thing that I think I don't, this isn't as much a Lutheran conviction, and so I don't want to come at all Lutherans with this, but like if you want to read like a Lutheran theology, you got to go back like 100 years because they're just not like super public facing, for instance. And I'm like very convicted that as like a Christian, we should be open and we should share and should communicate with other people. So I don't agree with that like approach. I'm not saying every Lutheran's like that. I'm not sure I agree with like their stance on communion, which is like the bread and the blood are literally Jesus's bread, his body and blood literally are present in that somehow. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I'm not convinced on that. But yeah, there's just like different beliefs that side beliefs I would say that I've come to and wrestled with for sure.
Okay.
I would say my explanation would be pretty similar to Ethan, in that I would say maybe closer to my freshman year, maybe end of high school, there was a period where there was some like questioning. I would also say that, and I would guess that Ethan probably feels similar to this, but before college, I would say the importance of faith in my life was nowhere near as strong. I think a lot of it was like that was the way we were raised, and so we were taught to go to church and pray and all of that. But I don't really remember thinking of it as something super important. And so I remember going off to college and really feeling like academics was like the one thing that was really important to me, and that it didn't matter if I was really involved in church that much because I was going to make a ton of money, and that was going to be like my contribution to the church because then I could, be more generous with my money. Um, but then getting involved in a Bible study there and getting to know a lot of the guys there and seeing what it was actually like to be in a church community, studying the Bible not more. I think through that process, I realized that like being part of a church and being part of a Christian community really is integral to faith. Like actually spending regular time with God, like in scripture or prayer, is very important for a Christian to grow. And so I would say like through that, by the end of my freshman year, faith was a very, very much more significant component of my life. And as a result of that, my focus on academics and the amount of weight I placed on it, I saw decrease a fairly significant amount. And enough so, like looking back, I think I would raise my kids to value things differently and not be quite as obsessive as I feel that I was from like my junior year to my freshman year of college, and put a greater priority maybe on like having like stronger friendships and really like investing in faith a little bit more.
I think too, just to add to that, because I think I would 100% agree with what Jesse is saying there and have the same experience where I think when we were both kids, we probably would have rationalized to ourselves like I'm not trying to like attack anyone here, but I think that valuing education the way that we did was wrong. Like I think we both put too much time into it, and I just don't think that's the right way to spend your life where you're separating from the world so that you're not loving people and spending time with people and getting to know people, and instead you've got your head in a book. I just don't think that's a good way to live. And I think we both kind of came to that conclusion and maybe rationalized doing that to ourselves is like you got to work your hardest at everything to honor God. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but is it honoring to God if you sit there and read all day and you don't, show love to your friend who's going through a breakup and have dinner with people that you know and show people that you care about them. Like, I think we both have kind of shifted in that a lot.
And for both of you guys, Ethan specifically, you brought up the point that you were contemplating a lot of things and looking over the Bible and deciding about God and Jesus. What were some of the things that you read or that you saw that you felt like gave the New Testament validity and solidified it in terms of your belief in who Jesus was and what he did?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so at that time. So I can tell you what I thought at that time, and then I can tell you like as I've been thinking more about it.
Sure.
So
Or now, yeah.
I think at that time, what was most interesting to me was, so let's see. So there's a guy who did a study. His last name is Habermas, and he went through all these biblical scholars. So like there's conservative scholars, but there's also just scholars that like aren't Christians, and this is just like their occupation. And so he went through all of these scholars' studies, and he found only the things that they all agreed upon, and he made a list of them. So that way you're not just getting this, ultra conservative input. Okay. So they agreed on essentially that like 6 or 7 of Paul's letters were actually written by Paul. Now I believe they're all written by Paul, but I'm just saying like what all of these guys agreed on. So they affirmed that, and if you go to the minimal, like the smallest number of things that they all actually affirmed about that, you essentially walk away with like these guys all believe that Jesus lived, they all believe that he died, and most importantly, they all believe that his disciples believed he raised from the dead. So I think that's the key thing there. Is so they're not all saying Jesus raised from the dead. They're saying the disciples believed he raised from the dead. So I think the biggest question is then, well, why were all of these disciples, except for one, willing to die for that? They must have really been convinced that it was true if they were willing to do that, right? We have like stories not in the Bible about these guys dying, and I think it's like tradition is that all of them were killed except for one. Like we have a Jewish historian recording Peter and I think Paul both being killed in like 64 AD by an emperor named Nero. And so it's like these guys were all willing to die. So that was really intriguing to me. And then I also think it's really intriguing that Paul, who's recorded as this guy who hated Jesus, he's going around killing all of these people. So he's like the least likely person to convert. And then somehow he has this experience and his whole life changes around, and he's willing to go through all of this suffering, all of this pain and hardship, abuse and mistreatment and shipwrecks and all of this. He's willing to do it because he's so convinced that Jesus raised from the dead. So to me, that like Jesus raising from the dead is kind of like, I think, the bedrock of Christianity. And so with that, then I think that if that's true and Jesus' authority was true and Jesus is God on earth, then the church that he established and the apostles and disciples that were following him and that he kind of like gave authority to, that's where I would kind of derive the authority of the New Testament, is like, I have faith in Jesus and what he did. So I have faith in the authority that he gave to his disciples and the writings that they put out.
If someone were to ask you about the idea of there were 12 men that were willing to lay their life down for Jesus, and they proposed to you, well, President Trump probably has just as many people right now who would lay their life down for him, or if we look at possibly the Muslim religion and some of the things that some of those people do in the name of Allah or Muhammad, how would you kind of try to substantiate those claims when they're essentially trying to come at you from the same perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I would want to think about is like, if we look at their culture, the way that Jewish culture worked is it was very honor and shame oriented. And there was a large amount of shame associated with like weakness and death, and specifically like in Judaism, like death on a cross, right? So if you're hanging on a tree, there's like a verse that's like, cursed is the one who hangs on a tree, right? It's not a good thing, it's a shameful thing. And so to associate yourself with something shameful like that, I think has like a higher bar, a higher cost. And so it's going to like take more for you to choose to do that than to choose to align with someone who you like politically, for instance, right? You're choosing to take on shame. And so with that, then I think it would like these, and I mean, from the recordings that we have, in the Bible, it's like these disciples weren't necessarily expecting Jesus to raise again from the dead, even though he tried to tell them that. They weren't necessarily expecting that. So for me, when we look at that and then we say, but somehow all of these guys who should have had this high bar of shame didn't seem like they believed Jesus was going to rise from the dead, all of a sudden just were like convinced, so convinced that they died. I think that's maybe the distinction I would make is like, there's no benefit to them if they're like faking it, for instance, but there is a benefit to people who are willing to like, for instance, like align with Trump really highly because they care about these values that he's doing and they aren't risking their lives.
I'll add one thing to that as well. I do think that, to me, like the biggest distinction between the other examples you gave in Christianity and between Christianity and other religions is that the claims being made are factual claims about things that the disciples say actually happened, right? I think it would be a very different situation if something miraculous was claimed to have happened about Trump, and then you had 12 people who like really actually believed that and saw that happen, but had every reason to know whether it was true or false. With Islam, for example, uh, my understanding is that all of the teachings in that religion come from like revelations by a single individual that can't be falsified or proven true by any other person. Similarly, Mormons, all of their views come from like a single guy's revelations that nobody else can look at, prove to be true or false. Whereas with Christianity, the disciples are writing about all of these claims about people that Jesus met, people that Jesus healed, Jesus raising from the dead. And they make this claim, I don't remember which gospel it is, that Jesus was seen by like hundreds of people after he rose again from the dead. If they then send out these letters to these communities that are supposedly Christians following Jesus, and there are all these things in the letters that the people can be like, well, hold up, I live in this town where you're saying Jesus did something like 20 years ago and nobody ever saw him here. There's no like reason to think that he raised anybody from the dead, like the Lazarus story. There's no reason to think that he did any healings or taught here. Then they wouldn't have bought into it. So I think like the big difference is that there are like real historical claims being made in real time about who Jesus is and what he did, that the disciples had like a reason to know whether they were false or not. They're not just ideological claims.
And so I guess one of the concerns that I have is if you go and you look through the Old Testament and you read through it, it seems like there is almost a perfect layout as to how life should be with the setup of the temple, with sacrifice, with just everything just works. Like the Jewish festivals, they're a circular activity where you start one and you go around and year after year and you try to progress and you get closer and you try to get closer and you try to be a better human being in terms of sinning and removing sin from your life. And with that, you go from a book where it seems like everything is already set out, and then you go to this new thing to where it seems like there's just this new revelation that wasn't necessarily needed if we go to the old book that was there. So when you guys think about that, what do you think, I guess, is the purpose of Jesus, and how do you try to think about looking at the Old Testament and understanding, okay, there's something new that needed to happen?
Yeah. So Jesse, you look like you're ready, so I can give like maybe the first half of an answer, and then your twin power can tap in and finish it. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind is if we're looking at like the grand narrative of Scripture, like what's happening. So God creates this good creation, and the creation like rebels against him and falls, and so then the whole storyline of Scripture is about how is God going to restore this people to himself. And so what I think is maybe the most important about relating, or one of the most important things about relating Jewish law to then the New Testament revelation, is that if you look at Genesis, before any of that law was given, right? The law is given in like end of Exodus, like Exodus 20 onward, Leviticus, some in Numbers. He goes over it again in Deuteronomy. But in
Well,
Genesis,
there is a thought that some of it was given in Genesis because of the fact that when Noah was taking animals on the ark, it was clearly stated that he was taking two of each clean animal, or two of each unclean animal, and seven of each clean animal. So there is a thought that the law could have been given previously to Exodus, just wasn't made clear until we get further out into the Old Testament.
so I think that Genesis was written after the law was given, And
Okay.
so the author can look back and make those observations, but I don't at least personally, I wouldn't believe that they had the law. So that's why the author can look back and say those things, but it wasn't necessarily known. And I think there probably could have been like some Jewish custom, like, or Jewish is the wrong word because those are the descendants of Abraham, but there could have been some sort of knowledge, but I definitely wouldn't think that it was like a full-fledged law. But I mean, I'm totally understand that someone might disagree with that. But I think from my perspective, what I would say is before that law was given, Abraham was given a promise, and it was that God was going to make a people through him and restore all of the nations through that people. And so then it's like, okay, Abraham has this promise of descendants, he has this promise of land, he has promise of restoration with God, and you see the people of Israel journeying towards that, and there's these rises and these falls based on how faithful to the covenant they are. But within that, you have these promises from God of, like, for instance, there's going to be another prophet like Moses, and we never see that prophet appear there. I think it's like reiterated, like, but this wasn't the prophet, this wasn't the prophet until Jesus comes. You have these promises of like God's people having his law written on their heart and being filled with his spirit. You don't have that until after Jesus. And yeah, Jesse, do you want to continue or?
Yeah, I wish I had like a little more time to organize my thoughts because I think this is a complicated issue. But the way I would describe the relationship is the way that I think like both the book of Galatians and Hebrews speaks about the relationship between the old covenant and the new covenant is that the old covenant was a temporary imperfect guardian that was ultimately fulfilled by Jesus. And so Ethan, I think, described some ways in which the old covenant was imperfect. For one, like God always had this plan to graft in the Gentiles, the people who weren't Jews, to be part of his people as well. And that's not accomplished until Jesus comes. I think also the book of Hebrews talks about how ultimately even the people in the Old Testament who are saved through Jesus. It's just more of a like sort of retroactive application of the promise because the Old Testament sacrifices are actually imperfect to save. Um, and so
We lost you, Jesse.
Yeah, you muted yourself.
Now you're muted.
I started getting a phone.
Oh, there you go. You're good.
Paige keeps trying to call me, and so it's locking me out. So the I guess maybe the philosophical way that you would describe, and Ethan, tell me if you think I'm getting in an incorrect area here. That you could describe the Old Testament sacrifice as being imperfect, is that as people who have sinned against God, we have committed an affront against a perfect Creator, and the gap that creates between us and God is infinite. It can't be filled by the death of some animal that is also flawed and not holy. And so, truly, the only death that can pay for um, the sort of debt that we have acquired, the separation that's been created between us and God, is the death of a perfect, holy, timeless being, and that's what we see through God's love when Jesus comes and dies on the cross. And so I think that, I guess, to sum that up, the way what I would say is that the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, was imperfect because it was incapable of truly saving in the way that Jesus was capable of saving, and he was the fulfillment of all of those things in the Old Testament that foreshadow his coming.
Which, for example, is why they would have to like do the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, every single year, right? It was this thing because their sin wasn't fully taken away, and so they had to repeatedly do this thing.
And your thoughts with Jesus coming and being that Messiah, then we still sin on a daily basis. And so, what are your thoughts on why we're still here going through what we call life and still sinning and still struggling with these things when we have Messiah and ultimate sacrifice that's there? And how is that any different than each year going through Yom Kippur? And I think Yom Kippur is actually really, really important for each person individually to be able to understand the wrongdoings that they've committed over the previous year. Because I think it's easy to have a Christian mindset and say, well, I did a lot of bad things, but you know what? Jesus is my covering. He's my dude. He's my guy. He's got me. And kind of forgetting, maybe because the Ten Commandments, right? I think it's what the first six are between man and man, and then the last four are between man and God, and that the transgressions that we make, even though we can ask for forgiveness between us and God, and we can have that forgiveness, there's also sins that we commit between man and man. And sometimes if we go throughout a year, Yom Kippur specifically is a day where you're going back and you're reaching out to each one of those individual people that you feel like you have wronged or you've done something to, and asking to have those things rectified. And I can see the great importance of being able to do that still as a human race. So when you guys think about that and having this Messiah that's done all these things, when you theoretically think about this, like, why are we still going through this? Like, why are we still doing it? Why isn't it just over?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first comment I would make is I think I hear what you're saying, and I 100% agree with it because it's something that we see with Christians, right? And so I think the only thing I would add to that is I think no matter what system you have, because humans are imperfect, they're gonna abuse it in some way, right? So with like a Jewish system, there's this great factor of remembrance, like you're talking about. But it's also easy to do this ritual where then you think, okay, I'm checking the box, and like one of the prophets like talks about the people's like, yeah, you're committing these sacrifices, but your hearts are far from me, right? So it gets easier to like detach that from God. So, and I'm not saying that was a bad like that wasn't a good system because I believe God put it in place. But I think that there's like difficulties with any system. That said, I think, and Jesse, you might have more to add to this, but I think the reason that we're still here and still going through this,
Can I
and
add to the first piece
yeah,
you said before you go into why we're still here?
mhm.
Like the comment as to like why Jesus is different. I guess I would say like, well, when you do these remembrances and reach out and try to apologize to every person you're trying to apologize to, do you miss people? Almost certainly. And almost certainly you don't notice all of the sins you do, all of the wrongs you do. And so I think the message of the New Testament is that people are imperfect and cannot acquire salvation by their own doing, right? That's why we can't sacrifice, we can't uh, do good works, we can't apologize and have that cover up the blemishes that we've done because we're also imperfect. That ultimately the good is going to outweigh the bad, and regardless, the good doesn't take away the bad because you've still done the bad. And so in the end, you still need something to cover up that sin. And if you're incapable of doing it, the only one capable of doing it would be God. Um, so then I'll pass it back to Ethan on the piece why we're still here.
Yeah. So I mean, I just have maybe a short answer, and maybe you can add to this, Jesse. But and again, I'm sorry, I'm not doing good quoting things here because I'm like forgetting the references. But one of the ways that one of the New Testament books explains it is that is that God is patient.
Ethan 2:14.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Is that God is patient and wants like more people to be saved is essentially what it's communicating. So, like the way that I would look at it is that God is like graciously waiting and patiently waiting for more people to put their like faith and commit to Him. And I think that if we look at even the state of the world now, we can see that that's like more true than it was like 2,000 years ago. So, like for instance, most people perceive Christianity as a very Western religion, right? It's America, it's Europe, and it's all these white people imposing their religion on minorities. And in reality, that's only 40% of Christians in the world, and 60% of Christians live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so I think even like as Scripture puts forward, like God is being patient, I think we see like the fruit of that bearing out.
Yeah. I think also like you could take this question back even further and it gets even more difficult. Like why did God do all of this in the first place? Why isn't everyone saved? Why do we have to have this like long drawn out process over history? And I think there maybe is a point where we need to recognize that God's ways are greater than ours, and at some point we're not gonna be able to like understand entirely why he does everything that he does. And if we could, I think that would maybe be a really good sense that it's a really good indication that we have a man-made religion. Because it doesn't make sense that finite people would be able to understand everything that God does. But it does seem that he has this sort of narrative, like Ethan was talking about, that he plays throughout history where the Jewish people are used to bring forth the Messiah. and spread his word to all of mankind. And so I think it's some combination of his love for us, like Ethan said, and wanting to draw more people to him, and he brings glory to himself by demonstrating his power and his goodness and his mercy and his justice to people as all of this plays out.
Yeah, and I started, I guess, getting off track from this because I wanted to ask you guys these questions again, essentially for my own ultimate pleasure. Because one of the struggles that I'm currently having intellectually is based off some of the things you're talking about, is that the ultimate sin of the world progressively getting worse and then needing Jesus to come along as a savior. Whereas if we go back to the very beginning, this idea, I think, of what God had or what the creation story is, and then Adam and Eve right there at the very beginning, boom. So essentially, ever since that point, there's been this need for something else. And so sometimes the struggle that I see is like, oh, okay, well, if there was a need for something else, he tried this way with the sacrifice, and now he's trying this way with Jesus. And so it can progressively. And so I just don't know if I have super great answers when people ask me these types of questions, because I can somewhat understand where they're coming from that.
Yeah, I think I guess I'll say one quick thing and then pass it over to Ethan because he might have a better answer than me. But I think some of it maybe does come down to God being a storyteller, right? Like we don't write stories with nothing but the conclusion. And so I wouldn't say that God tried one thing and it didn't work out. I think he had this grand plan the entire time, and all throughout, he's planting these seeds of showing who the Messiah is going to be and what is to come. That's ultimately hard for us to see. But when Jesus is revealed, we're able to look back at all of these like amazing moments throughout the Old Testament that are reflected in Jesus. So like the prophet Isaiah, for example, has these prophecies about the coming Messiah who's going to die and suffer and take away and bear the trespasses of other people. There are like predictions about the line that the Messiah is going to come through, the place where the Messiah is going to be born. Then there are all these stories reflected in the Messiah, God's people being called out of Egypt when the like 10 plagues happens. We see that mirrored in Jesus, and the book of Matthew that you guys are going through explicitly talks about that. Like Jonah being in the belly of the whale for 3 days, that's mirrored in Jesus being in the heart of the earth for 3 days. And so you can just go through, and scholars have counted this up. Ethan would know these a lot better than me, but there are just like hundreds of little like seeds that God has planted all throughout the Old Testament that are ultimately reflected in Jesus and paint this big narrative. And so I would say that like that sort of storytelling side of things was intentional from the very start of creation.
Yeah, I think on the reference to Matthew, I think Matthew is one of the coolest books in the New Testament because of how it paints, because of how it relates Jesus to Israel, right? So we see Israel like cross through the sea. Israel had so Israel goes to Egypt, and God like has this exodus, right? And then Jesus goes to Egypt, and then he comes out of Egypt. Israel like goes through the parted Red Sea. Jesus is baptized and comes out of the water. Israel like goes for 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus is tempted for 40 days in the wilderness by Satan. Israel like has their laws given to them on a mountain. Jesus speaks his words of God on a mountain. So there's all these like parallels that you see like coming to fulfillment in Jesus. And I don't think it's
They're in
incidental.
the same order too, right? They're in the
Yeah,
same order that it
they're
plays out.
presented in that order. But the other thing I would say is I don't think Jesse and I also want to give the impression that we don't have any struggles with this, because like it's definitely not like we're like fully, oh, I understand this and this and this. We're like doing our best to give answers and our thoughts right now because we're having questions and talking about it. But I'm sure both of us could come up with plenty of things that it's like, man, this is hard and I'm not convinced. It's like we don't see everything perfectly, but I feel that I see enough to like go in this direction, I think is what I would say.
Yeah, and maybe a better question for you guys in regards to what you're doing and with all of this is where your hearts are and what inside of your heart makes you want to be able to translate the Bible to all these other people. And then for you, Jesse, I don't think you really got into detail what it is you're doing or who you're working with specifically. Would you be willing to share that?
Sure. Ethan, do you want to
Yes.
go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think the biggest thing would be as as I've become more committed to my faith and grown my love for God and His Word, I've seen, I believe, very important that Scripture like calls us to share our faith with others, and obviously do that respectfully. I don't believe we should like force our faith on people, but have good conversations and share with them what we believe and share with them what God has given to us. I think that's a good thing. And so, one is I just like I want my life to be oriented toward that. And then two is like Scripture in particular has played a huge role in me getting to the point where I am. So like as I was like really digging into my faith more and getting serious about it early in college, I started reading the Bible seriously for the first time and just absolutely loved it. And I had always been bored and felt like, what was the point of this before that? But I just began to look at it as this massive mystery of like the greatest mystery in the world. Like, why are we here? What is our purpose? Who is this God that I think I believe in right now? And so it just became this really interesting, fascinating book to me that I really wanted to understand. So I want other people to have access to that. And then I think the last bit would be with those like things that I care about and the goals that I have. I believe that God created me a certain way and with certain passions that lend really well to Bible translation. And so it's like I think that's the best way that I can combine my passions with my goal to go in a certain direction. So that would probably be the short end of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think my answer would be pretty similar. Like, I agree that God has created me with certain skills and blessings, and I want to use that in the way that I think I'm being led to. I think also, like Ethan said, I'm convinced that Christ died on the cross for my sins, and were it not for that, I deserve to suffer eternally, and I'm eternally grateful to God for that. And so I want my life to be an outpouring of that gratefulness, and to use my education in a way that I guess is like maximally honoring to God. And I certainly don't think that all Christians need to do a career in a way that is like directly tied to their faith. Most people don't. And I think that's fine. And I think it would be bad if every single person tried to do something like that. But that's like the particular direction that I've felt led. So then the organization that I'm working for is called the Alliance Defending Freedom. I'll start working for them in August, and they do religious liberty litigation. A lot of their cases are a bit more controversial, but their stated mission is to hold open the doors for the spread of the gospel. So everything that they're oriented towards doing is in some way uh, oriented toward the goal of trying to help more people come to know Christ. So they do a fair amount of like pro-life related work. They were a part of the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. They do work on freedom of conscience in the workplace. So like laws that would restrict Christians from being able to live out the way that they believe they're supposed to live out their faith. So if you're familiar with the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that was in Colorado, where there was a gay couple that came to um, a wedding cake baker and asked him to bake a cake. And he said that he would bake any cake for them except for a wedding cake because he didn't feel that it would be in line with his conscience to support a a wedding between two people that he believed God instructs not to be married. Um, and so, but the state law required him to do so. So the Alliance Defending Freedom challenged that state law, and they ended up winning on his behalf. This was a big case in the news that went before the Supreme Court a couple years ago. There's another case right now where the state of Oregon is not allowing parents to foster or adopt at all from the state if they do not agree with the state's views on sexuality and gender, regardless of whether the child being fostered or adopted is would be considered LGBT. And so, as you can imagine, there are a lot of Christians that wouldn't agree with the state's view on that. And so that keeps them, and they're a fairly large portion of people who would help with the foster care system, that keeps them from being able to partake in that. And so, kind of like the mission is to help Christians be able to live in accordance with what they believe God's word says. Um, and so certainly like the organization is not like hateful of people of different views. They're not like trying to prevent people who are LGBT from living their lives, but we do have a view on sex and sexuality that we want Christians to be able to live out and do so lovingly. But we want to make sure that the state is not preventing Christians or taking away their licenses if they don't agree with the state on those things.
Okay, and so that's something that's interesting. So you guys coming up from a religious background and then going into public school systems where there's a lot of different views, a lot of different religious beliefs. And in order to, I would assume, pass classes, sometimes you may not be able to share your true thoughts and opinions when it comes to this. But also, I think right now, where you guys are in the current workplace, do you ever feel restricted in maybe being able to share your beliefs at any point in time? And what do you say to other people who do feel that way because of where they're currently at?
So I never experienced that in undergrad, and I think probably the same for Ethan, at least in classes, because we were mostly engineering classes, and so topics
We
like
had
that
it a
didn't really
lot
come up.
less. Yeah.
We had it a lot less. In law school, I felt that a lot more, not as much in the classroom, but more in conversations with people. I've never been like one to not like talk about being a Christian and how my faith is important to me, but I do stray away from talking about more controversial issues like the ones that I just mentioned, because I think that while I believe they're true, I do think they're secondary, and I don't want somebody who is more on the left to you know, not be willing to listen to me talk about my faith if that kind of conversation comes up because they see it as only for people who are on the right. And so I've like strayed away from those conversations in law school, and it has given me the opportunity to talk about faith with a lot of classmates, or a lot is maybe an exaggeration, at least a couple. Um, and so I think that's kind of how I've approached it. I also know people who have been more bold, and that has worked out fine for them as well.
I think my experience is similar, other than I think what you're forgetting is Jesse and I were both RAs for a short time
Oh,
in undergrad, and that was very heavily pushing different values. So because it
RA
was
is resident advisor,
yeah,
right?
resident assistant maybe. It's where you're like in charge of housing essentially,
Oh,
and then
okay.
you get like a little decrease on your tuition from doing that.
Okay.
So we both did that because we wanted the money, but you had to go through this class where they taught you all of their values. And so the whole class was pretty much just oriented towards pushing a lot of ideas that, like, I mean, yeah, that we would just disagree with. It wasn't all like that. I mean, I don't want to, I would never say, oh, there's no good to what people on the other side of belief have, right? Like, I think there's plenty of good things that they're offering, but there were also plenty of things that we disagreed with. And like, my class knew that I was Christian, or at least some of them did. And I had a one-on-one interview with my director, whoever was above me. And she just like straight up asked me, she's like, well, what do you think about gay marriage? And I was like terrified to answer that, but I did. And I answered honestly. And she was like, oh, okay. Like, that's fine. And so I think I think sometimes it's easier to be worried. It's easy to be like more worried that people are going to be hateful than they are. Like, I've had multiple experiences where I went in expecting someone to like be very opposed to what I had to say and to Christianity, and they were super loving and fine. So I think it's easy to do that for people who are struggling and are in that situation. I would encourage them with that. I would encourage them with like, yeah, I think like as Christians we're going to encounter difficulties and struggles, and that's one of them. But that like Jesus encourages us to live a certain way despite that. And I think that this life here is temporary. And I mean, that's the easy answer to give when I'm not going through something difficult, right? But I think this life here is temporary, and it's good to be oriented towards the future as well.
Yeah, and I think the important thing with both of the messages you guys just shared has to do with your approach. In that no matter what your belief systems are, as long as you have the right approach, and like Jake said from the very beginning, he always enjoyed your guys' hearts. And as long as we have good hearts in terms of our approach, and we're not one of those like that there boy over there, he support Biden, who's a dumbass. You know what I mean? Like
That
you
sounded
start
too
getting,
natural.
yeah. When you start
That's
getting
Chad off
to
camera.
that, it's just like it's the approach, right? It's just like how you say things. Like what was I've thought about different aspects of life. Like some this morning, I was telling someone about a roller coaster at SeaWorld and being my absolute favorite. And he had previously told me that he doesn't like hunting and he's very, kind of into protecting animals. He's like, yeah, I would never support SeaWorld. And so that could have been an approach. Was like, why wouldn't you do that? So, and it's like, no, I already understand why people don't support SeaWorld. I've watched numerous videos and I have that understanding. And okay, I'm going to leave it at that. And I completely understand and I can see the good and I can see why someone wouldn't want to support SeaWorld instead of trying to sit there and change his mind. It's like, well, why wouldn't you? It's like, yeah, but there's so many opportunities for us to try to change someone's mind. And I think with having the right approach, you realize that you can't control people, but what you can give them is your best view of what you believe, your best stance, and also walking through action in how we display that, and not just what we say by the answer that we give.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with that. And I think it's also like people don't care what you have to say if you're rude about it. Like it's also just like one, yes, it's good to be loving, but also like if you want to, share with people, it might be nice to be decent to them. So I think that is an area where I also feel attention, right? Because I want to be loving and gentle and kind and good to people. And yet because I believe this thing and I care about these people, I want them to believe it too and I want to share it, right? So it's this tension for sure. But I think that ultimately we should approach everything in love. So
And my biggest struggle is one, I want to be able to love people. One, I also want to share my opinion. One, I also want to laugh and joke around. And
yeah.
sometimes those three things are extremely difficult because I have a very easy way of making people upset, including some of my siblings. And it's just
Something to kind of piggyback of what Chad said, or well, I guess I said it and then Chad kind of brought it up again, but it's just you guys kind of going with your moral compass and kind of doing what's right. And kind of Jesse was saying earlier, he was, I'm going to go all into academics, and then my contribution to church, my way of being faithful is to donate all of this money because I worked so hard. I made this high paying job. I did that. And then my contribution to faith will be donating all of this money. And then later kind of determining to go a different route. And I can't remember one of the recent times that we hung out, Jesse was telling me about this thing with his law school that after a certain amount of years or whatever, if something with the tuition, if you pay it and after a certain amount of time, whatever, they'll pay it off. If you are going down and taking actual cases or doing whatever, I can't remember how you worded it, but it's just that really stood out to me and kind of emphasized your moral compass, and you were going to do what you believe was right for you to do. You could have been a lawyer, done all of these high profile cases, won all of these cases. Maybe you're on the OJ case and you win OJ and you make a ton of money off of it. But that's not what you are trying to do. You genuinely care about the benefit of people and you want to kind of make a difference in people's lives and not necessarily going after the big bucks cases, but just kind of going through with that. And then another thing on top of that, I remember you telling me about this one story when you were in a coffee shop or something one time and this guy came up to you and just basically started telling you about his story, and you had no financial gain from doing any of this, but you went over to his house and you started going through things with him and kind of trying to help him out. And then you were talking about how you were on the phone with Ethan because you were a little bit scared for your safety or something. I don't remember, but
you're close. You're close. You
Yeah,
should tell
yeah.
that story, Jesse. That's a good story.
Okay, I want to let Jake finish his question.
Oh, sorry,
Oh
sorry.
no, that's just kind of where I was going. It's just you're kind of staying true to yourself and your own beliefs, and you're not letting outside pressures kind of dictate where your life goes and how you make your decisions.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think, like, I certainly make mistakes and do things that I look back on and I'm like, yeah, that wasn't true to what I believe. I think for me, the ultimate goal is to try to make decisions in accordance with scripture. And so, you mentioned uh like me being willing to take a pay cut and work for a job, do a job that's going to make less money, but will be ultimately, I think, more helpful to people. Like I see in scripture that we're not called to live for money, but to live for helping other people. Similarly, when I kind of pivoted in early college to caring more about community than making a ton of money, I think likewise in scripture you see the importance of being a part of a Christian community, and the model that you see Christians living in the Bible and Jesus included is one of like very personal ministry, not just like, doing your own thing, obtaining glory for yourself and then losing using like the money that you get on the back end to try to just like check off a box of like honoring God. I think like honestly looking back, I think the motivation there was because I wanted to do something that would like make me really successful, make me look really good, not because I really had the motivation of like, oh, I want to give all this money to the church.
Mm.
Um, but so okay, so then the story that you mentioned, I had just moved to Milwaukee and I was living in this Airbnb. And some guy comes up to the door and he knocks on it at like 10 p.m. at night. It's dark. This is like a sketchy area. Like I'd hear gunshots at night. This was, shortly out of college. So I hadn't made much money working yet. And so I kind of had to take the first joint I could get. And so I opened the door and this guy is like, just like wanting to chat with me. I think he used to know somebody that lived there, but I'm just like a dude renting an Airbnb. And so then he looks at me and he's like, "So what do you do for work, man?" I'm like, "Oh, I work for a law firm." He's like, "Oh, you're a lawyer." I'm like, "No, I'm not a lawyer." And he goes, "Oh, but you know how to use computers?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know how to use computers." so, so he's like, "Oh, well, I got this case I got to tell you about." Then he launches into this case about how he was chased by the police in like a high speed chase and then pulled off on the side of the road and they beat him up. And so he has this like $1 million case going. I looked up, he showed me the case. It was like a real pending case, but I'm pretty sure all of it was bogus. Um, but anyway, so I told him that I would help him because he told me that he needed help getting things filed by a deadline. And he had this body cam footage that he was going to show me. And I was like really invested in the case because I was like, shoot, this might be real. Like, I want to see if this like actually happened. And if it happened, I want this guy to get his money. So I told him I'd help him. I let him get in my car, and that was when I called Ethan because I was like, "Yeah, this is probably not wise." He had some drinks with him, which is ultimately what he gave me for payment. He told me I could have his drinks. But so I went to drive him to a coffee shop where we were going to do this. He's like, "All right, we got to stop at my apartment to go get the evidence." So we stop at his apartment, and then he's like, "Oh, well, we can just work here." So he's trying to get me to come inside. I'm like, "No, I'm not going to come inside." Um,
I'm on the phone. I'm like, don't go.
Yeah.
Because this is the guy who let him in his car. So you know that
But-
he's not maybe going to make the best decisions.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then he's like downstairs waiting for his mom to bring his evidence down. And so he calls her and he's on the phone and he's like, "Mom, you gotta come meet this guy. I got a lawyer." I'm like, "No, I'm still not a lawyer." Anyways, this whole thing took like 2.5 hours. And so by this time Starbucks was closed. And I was like, "All right, dude, I gotta help you tomorrow instead after I'm done with church." And so he said, "Okay." I gave him my phone number. Then he didn't call me that day. And then he called me like a random day later in the week and I couldn't go. And unfortunately it kind of fizzled out. And I had since then I talked to people and they were like, "Jesse, this like isn't wise. You don't know anything about this dude." So my plan was to refer him to like free legal counsel where he could get some help. There's like a clinic in the city. And then he just never called me back again. And that was kind of the end of it. So no real resolution to the story, but
Oh man.
it was a fun ride while it was happening.
Ugh. Ethan, what was going through your mind when that that whole debacle was going on?
Uh, I was worried for sure. I mean, and this guy like kept trying to get him to come up. It wasn't like he asked once. It was like, why don't we just do it here? Why
Right.
don't we just do it here? He's like, why can't we just go up and just, he's like, no, let's go to Starbucks.
Well,
And then
how
when
old was this guy? You said that his mom, like, he called his mom to bring down his stuff. Was he
So
like 18 or
I
13
think he
or
was
like
like, I think he was
40?
like 45, but I think he might have been a little bit off. And so I think
Intoxicated.
yeah, maybe
uh,
intoxicated.
he might have been a
Um,
little disabled, right?
Ah,
yeah, he might have been disabled.
Yeah.
I see.
And so that is probably part of why I didn't feel like as nervous, because I could kind of tell that. But he also, I ended up looking him up afterwards, and this was part of why I didn't end up going again, was because he did have a felony.
Oh,
Because when I was driving him, he was telling me how he had recently gotten out of prison, so I looked him
oh,
up. It wasn't
nice.
anything like violent. He
Just
stole
like murder or something or what?
no, he stole a truckload of stuff worth over $10,000, and so I guess that got him prison time. That seems
And left the previous driver like alongside the road, like in a
Yeah,
ditch.
yeah.
I don't think so. So the only charge I saw was for the theft of that large amount of property. It's like he ran and jumped a FedEx or something like that.
Oh.
Um, but so it wasn't like the most scary record, but I still didn't want to mess with it.
So he had jumped a vehicle before, is what you're saying.
He stole a vehicle. It said it was like a box truck. It was like a box truck type car with the charge was like stole over $10,000, I think
So he
was
probably wouldn't steal your vehicle. That's no
yeah,
worry.
Yeah.
yeah, fair enough. Well, plus he was going to get a lot more money when I won the lawsuit for him, so that
Oh,
wouldn't
yeah.
have been too helpful.
Yeah, his eyes were on the prize.
Right.
Well, maybe the cops were beating him up from stealing this semi that you saw that was in.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Oh.
Uh,
But yeah,
Do you
just
have any more questions, Jake?
um no, not that I can remember off the top of my head. No. Do you?
So I remember one story of your guys' dad. I'm going to ask you guys to tell a story if you know of any of our dads where you guys were all playing all-star baseball, and my brother Josh and Isaac,
Mm-hmm.
like whenever we see your dad, they always bring this up, is that
Mm-hmm.
Josh is always like, you boys want a beef stick? Because your dad used to go out hunting, and then he would wrap up all of the jerky into the little wraps. And so that's a story that Josh always brings up. He's like, there's Rob. You boys want a beef stick?
Oh yeah, it gets mentioned every
This-
time.
Yeah.
This still happens. My girlfriend
Yeah.
was visiting this weekend, and she got offered jerky plenty of times. So
Nice.
it's still
It's
still a
always
thing.
his deer meat that he's
Wait,
off.
wait.
Yeah, it's always great.
Jesse, you ask your girlfriend if she wants a beef stick, or your dad ask her?
Well, it was just jerky this time. Just beef jerky.
Okay. That's good.
And then
I can
Ethan,
tell.
you go ahead. Ethan had a
Yeah.
story.
I don't know if this is like the best story, but I just felt like it was a particular connection that I had to your dad. Well, first I'll say I remember because we were pretty young. I don't remember all the content of specific situations, but I always remember enjoying talking to your dad and like being like, "Oh, like what's he gonna harass me about?" Like this conversation. It was always it was always fun. But I remember a connection that we had was there was this show named called My Name is Earl.
Oh, yeah.
And I was the only person I knew who had watched that show. It's the show about this dude who lives in a trailer park and he like wins the lottery and then loses it. And so he's like working to work off his karma or something and I don't know. That's the premise of the show. It's a pretty weird show. And when I came over to your house, your dad was watching My Name is Earl. And I remember you told me that he watched that show like multiple times, right?
Oh
Like
yeah,
through
yeah,
the
yeah.
show.
Yeah.
So that was a special connection we had, was watching that. Yeah.
Do you have any stories, Jesse, that stick out to you or no?
I think, well, when Ethan and I were talking, that was the same thing that I said. But similarly, I just remember always having a lot of fun with your dad. I remember him driving us home from baseball a couple times, and we'd always be joking around and we'd be ragging on the coach together. I remember talking about clip foul with him.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if I have any other specific funny stories.
So I wonder, did this conversation ever come up between your parents? Like, listen, like you guys can't go over and be around Mr. Abs. He's like a really bad influence. He smokes. He swears. We can't let him go over to the Abs house. Was that ever a conversation in your family?
No.
If it was not in front of us. No, we were always allowed to come over.
That's good.
I remember them being a little worried about you.
Oh yeah.
Who, me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, they should
I don't
be.
think you weren't there by the time we were coming around, or at least not as much.
Mhm.
Well, because Chad Coached our basketball team. Remember?
Oh yeah, the swag,
Swag
masters.
Masters.
Oh
Master.
yeah, but that was when we were younger. Wait, Brittany helped with that too, right?
I don't think so.
No, I was a coach when you guys were in what, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, because Chance Stewart was the coach of the other team.
Okay.
So it was Jake, Sam, you two, and then we did that Sturgis tournament where Brecken played with us, and we were called. You guys wanted to be the Swag Masters or whatever.
Yeah. Dude, we were so good. I remember we got whooped, didn't we?
Yeah.
Did we?
Only one game.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, because we had a bunch of kids coming from like Three Rivers who were really good.
Oh
I think
yeah,
Jesse and I brought
huge.
down the average skill for sure.
Yeah.
That reminds me of one story. You speaking of bench warmers earlier in the episode.
Dude, I was
And
thinking about this earlier.
that one story. I don't remember if I've told it on this podcast before or if Chad even knows about it. It was you both of you two and I were sitting on the bench, and it was at a basketball game, and Bobby Wonders was coaching, and I can't even remember what happened. Somebody made a foul or somebody did a stupid play or something, and Bobby Wonders got so pissed off, and he had his little dry erase marker in his hand, and he goes, "Oh, come on!" And it just shattered on the floor. It just went all the way across the gym floor, and I just remember all three of us just sitting there busting ass laughing. And
Jake, that was a slight misinterpretation there.
okay,
We were all sitting there trying not to laugh.
Oh, I was laughing.
Loses it. And so the rest of us start laughing too. We're all like sitting there like straight face. It's like, come on, throws the thing. And Jake just lost it.
That was in high school?
Yeah.
Yeah, freshman year.
Freshman year.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Needless to say, I had a lot more fun on the bench that game than I did playing. Just sitting there laughing.
Joining the boys where they're keeping it warm for you.
Oh yeah. But yeah. And then something else I was going to say is doing this podcast has been very interesting. Just being able to put my thoughts into words more, and growing up, I was never somebody who really spoke my thoughts a whole lot. And that's been something that's really improved for me. But was it 2 weeks ago, we had Brett Shesky on the podcast, and he knew my dad because he grew up with Chad and was friends with Chad. And his story that he shared was he it was in Little League, and he hit a ball to the fence, and there was somebody on second base, and he wanted them to go to third, but they stayed on second. And so Brett could only get a single. And Brett was super furious about it. And my dad was on the first base fence, and he's like, "Oh, what? You wanted to double, Brett? You wanted a double? Rob put him down for a double." And that's what he wanted. And he was just talking about how he humbled him so much. And it was
No, Dad was the first base coach.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
That's awesome.
And it was just a story that neither one of us had ever heard before. So it was something, it's like we're continuing to learn about our dad through other people. And I feel like that's just, there's so many stories that we never experienced, but it's like our dad was always true to himself, regardless of if any of us were there or not. It's like he would have said that to some random kid if it was some random kid. It's not. It was just him being true to himself.
Well, I don't know if you've ever heard this story, Jake, or not, but it was when Josh was playing Little League. He was Rusty Kyle. You guys know who Rusty Kyle is, right?
Yeah.
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 Mrs.
So
Kyle's husband.
Rusty Kyle's son, Dan, was just old enough, I think, to be on Jake's team. And so my dad and Rusty, they were coaching together. And it's actually Scott Miller. You guys know who Scott Miller and his sons are, right? Yeah. So Scott Miller was the coach for the other team. And it was when they had created this rule in Little League where you don't really have to throw a ball to walk someone. And Dan gets up to bat and they were kind of like winning or whatever. And so Scott's like, oh, just put him on. And it was like the first time anybody ever used the rule, because I was like, just let the kids hit. It's Little League, right? And everybody's like, what's going on? What's going on, Mr. Abs? He's like, oh, and they're like, why'd they do that? He's like, because he's a jackass. And he yelled it across the field. And then like Scott Miller, he was religious at the time, and they kind of went into the dugout and had a little discussion about it, and everybody talked about it. And then they came over and like talked to my dad about it or whatever. So there was a whole big conversation about it. And after my dad said that, some of the kids were like, what's a jackass, Mr. Allen?
Oh no.
Did that deter your dad from talking the same way in the future, or did he
No.
keep
No way.
I mean, no.
No
It was like
way.
even my grandpa, like, he just wasn't really coaching, but he'd be sitting out there in the outfield fence when I was playing baseball. And oh my gosh, like you thought he was mad when you guys were playing baseball. Just imagine. It's like I think. Like I'm just finally working through some of the anxiety I had, like as a kid and now as an adult, to where it's like, poof, okay, I don't have to be super nervous about everything that goes on around me. I can kind of just breathe and be myself and not have to worry about like what's being said or what people are thinking.
That's so funny.
Gosh,
We had a
that's
similar
really
thing.
him. He's like, they're talking about you, Chad. They're talking about you. And like, I mean, I was just like, dude, like that will mind mess you up. I'm like, who's talking about me? Like, oh my gosh. Everywhere I would go, I think people are talking about me.
Oh no. That's funny. Our grandma was similar, and we would have to make her stop talking because she'd be like when we were playing tennis, Jake. I don't know if you were ever at one of the matches where she was at, but she'd be yelling at the other players and stuff. And it's like, tennis, you don't say anything in tennis.
Yeah.
Well, wait, she would go to some of your guys' baseball games too, wouldn't she?
Yeah.
In Little League.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I remember her yelling stuff. I don't remember specifics, but I remember being like a little worried about it.
That's right. I remember that. Because your mom and dad wouldn't sit by her, would they?
I think that's true.
I don't remember that. But it was always fun, It was funny, but like afterwards, but like in the moment, you're like, oh no, like what's happening?
Oh, I don't ever remember caring. I think mom was the one that was like embarrassed by it, and so I think like Chad is saying she might not have sat next to her because she didn't want to be associated. But I remember always thinking it was funny.
Well, I think that about sums it up.
Yeah. I guess to finish off the episode, I just appreciate you guys, just like Jake. We were getting into detail about a lot of questions and everything. And I think one thing that's very evident is your guys' heart, and that you've never succumbed to peer pressure. And I think that's something that's really, really difficult in society, especially as technology advances and social media becomes more popular, and just trying to be able to prove who you are versus staying true to who you are. And I think it's a struggle that maybe we all struggle with, and it's a journey that takes a lot of time. Sometimes I know for me, it's taken a lot of just sitting around by myself and having those feelings and just asking the deeper questions and looking at myself and asking and wondering who I am. Because sometimes maybe when you're not being successful in a career, or maybe you've lost a baseball career and it's no longer going to be there, or a significant other or something like that, and they're no longer there, that you have to ask those questions and to try to figure out, who am I, and how do I stay true to myself, and try to, instead of just trying to be accepted by people who in the long run, when I start thinking about them, I don't really want to be around, but it's that comfortableness of just not being alone. And coming from a small town, I think that can be really, really difficult, when everybody around you is one way. It can be difficult to try to find out who you are. And I think it's really cool that both of you guys had each other to be able to develop. But then as you were able to realize this on your own at an older age, to be able to spread your wings and fly, and to try to put yourselves out there, it's really important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us to do this. This was really fun. It was great to talk to both of you. We've seen Jake on and off throughout the years, but it was good to just sit down and have a conversation. It was really fun. So thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I've also enjoyed a couple of your guys' other podcasts. I think Ethan listens to one or two of the Bible ones, and then I've listened to the politics, and I listened to Peyton's episode about the rat farm. So
Yeah.
it's fun to see you guys making some content that's genuinely enjoyable to listen to. I think it's hard to do that, and a lot of times people will try to do something like this, and it's fun for people who know them already.
Mhm.
But I think you guys genuinely make content that's fun and funny and interesting to listen to.
Thank you.
Thanks. We both enjoy doing it. Like I said, as I continue to be on this journey that we're all on in terms of life, I just realize how important it is to ask difficult questions and try to be true to yourself and try to figure out what life is and what it's like. Like one of the episodes I have planned for the future is actually an episode on sex and trying to understand what that's like. I think coming from the private school system that we were in, something that my parents absolutely never talked about. I was never talked to about what it was. And so my expectations, my understanding of what it was very, very maybe stressful and caused me a lot of anxiety because I didn't really know what it was or how it is. And I don't think it's something that people talk about enough. And then we're left to have technology, social media, the internet guide us into what that looks like. And it's not a super healthy way, but you don't really ever know what's going on in other people's marriages or intimate lives or those types of things. And so it's just I don't know what normal is. Is this normal? Is that normal? How do we do this? How do we do that? And I think it's a really important conversation for people to have and to discuss. So
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds really interesting.
yeah. So
Alrighty.
thanks everybody for tuning in tonight, having identical twins on the show and being able to get some laughter, but also life lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for having us.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Alrighty. See you later, everybody.
You guys.